This video was digitized from the original DVD in 2023 by Simply Franciscan. It is part of the Zmuda-Moffat Collection of video recordings of lectures given by Franciscan professors and theologians on topics of Franciscan theology, charism, spirituality, and ministry. The lectures span more than 20 years. The Zmuda-Moffat Collection captures some of the seminal lectures shared with the Franciscan family in the rediscovery of the Franciscan Intellectual Tradition, a process which began in the 1970s and continues today. Sister Lisa Zmuda and Sister Kathleen Moffat videotaped these lectures from approximately 2001 through 2022 with permission from the speakers. Separately, they created and distributed study guides to accompany the recordings. Those study guides are available with the videos. Please look for a link in the YouTube post. For further information on the Zmuda-Moffat Collection, please visit our website at simplyfranciscan.org.
Creation. We can use this image in the way that we use an icon. Each of you could make your own icon of creation. Because I'm a gardener, I tend to look at creation through botany. Others, I suppose, would probably look at creation and their icon would be some of these marvelous views from the Hubble telescope of the extent of galaxy. I see, yes, we have an astronomer here. Another, a biologist, might put up here one of those highly magnified microscopic slides of a cell. Those who work in physics would find some image of a piece of iron expanding under heat that would somehow become for them the icon of creation. It could certainly be the picture of a human face. A geologist would probably select a stone. Each of us has our own icon of creation. In the Franciscan tradition, every creature, and we can add, and every human person, is an image of the incarnate Word, who is the image of God. We go from image to image. Creation is good, and the material world is a way into the experience of a good God. Let's go back and unpack those a bit. Just starting with the first. Every creature as image of the incarnate Word, the image of God. If I could put it in this way, God's best image of who God is Jesus of Nazareth. That image of a poor person from a marginalized area of an occupied country who was not particularly famous during most of his life, not particularly well known, not particularly controversial for most of his life. This hidden, unrecognized person, to believe that that person is the image of who God is, and that all creatures are formed in light of that individual, requires a remarkable act of faith. It is, again, the scandal of the incarnation. To believe that makes it then relatively simple to believe such a mystery as the Eucharist. To believe that the fullness of Godhead is present in a limited, frail creature. The corollary of that all creatures are created according to the exemplar of the incarnate Word, leads, I think, to a remarkable meditation on creatures themselves. Not only is creation good, but each creature is a theophany. That is, something capable of revealing who God is. Let me give you the opposite view for a minute. Set your heart on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of the Father, and not on things below, things of earth. The way that passages like that have been interpreted in our tradition have often been used to denigrate the world of creation, as if it were unimportant, that's the most benign, or that it is actually an impediment in our way toward God. The model of a kind of mysticism based in this opposing theological view is, in order to get closer to God, what we need to do is remove ourselves from the material, the historical, the creaturely, in order to enter some realm of the absolutely unconditioned, the completely invisible, the completely unnameable and unimaginable. That so-called cataphatic tradition actually underlies, apophatic tradition rather, underlies a lot of orthodox theology of the mainstream within the Catholic tradition as well as in Protestant traditions. The minority orthodoxy of the Franciscan tradition, along with the tradition of the Greek fathers, sees in creation and in each creature the possibility of seeing God. It's a sacramental view of creation. It has its limitations as well, but I think it is the lesser known tradition. To believe seriously that these individual creatures around us are theophanic, capable of revealing God, is, I think, a mystical kind of insight that we see in Francis himself, and we see faithfully carried out through a couple of generations of the Franciscan theological tradition, only to gradually disappear until the later 20th century. We're now rediscovering this. Creation is good. The material world is a way into experiencing a good God. The material world is not impediment, but avenue toward God. I'd like to give an anecdote here that some of you may have heard me talk about before, or you may have read. And it comes from Gerard Manley Hopkins, English Jesuit convert, Oxford educated, who joined the Society of Jesus, and with that took on a whole religious formation, which I think would probably have been similar to Franciscan formation at the time, in which he was trained to look down upon the things of earth in order to set his mind on the things of heaven. The tremendous moral crisis for Hopkins was, in fact, to try to distance himself from a creation that he loved deeply and found profoundly interesting. We have a remark from one of the Jesuit brothers at the college where the scholastic, Mr. Manley Hopkins, was studying, and he spoke about the way that Hopkins would run out to the path outside the college after a rainstorm. in order to throw himself down in his Jesuit soutane to look at the way that the sunlight reflected on the sand in the paths when they were wet. Those sand crystals captivated him. He had a similar obsession with the construction of oak leaves. The way that oak leaves formed themselves to make a kind of pattern that gives us the overall picture of an oak tree. In the sermons and religious formation that he was receiving, that was looked upon as a pretty bad thing. And his penance was to try to keep himself from what he considered was now a morally objectionable attachment to the things of the world. And we read as a kind of revelation for him about a holiday he took in Wales when he had just gotten his hands on a copy of Scotus from the library. And as he read the works of this Franciscan theologian, he began to see this view of creation not as impediment, but as avenue toward the experience of God. It became for him a kind of resurrection experience. As he said, he looked upon the stars at night and his head was full of Scotus. It was a conversion for him to find an ally that he did not know existed within the Catholic tradition who was able to look at creation with new eyes. Creation, fundamentally within the Franciscan tradition, flows from the Trinity, as I've mentioned when speaking about the Incarnation. Here we have a reproduction, it's not a very clear one, of Rublev, the great Russian iconographer, and his work called The Holy Trinity. It may seem odd to have this icon as an icon of creation, but I believe it really is. The image that we see there, we would also know as the three visitors to Abram. I guess Abraham by this time, when he is camping at Mamre under the terebinth, you can see that little tree up there. On the left-hand side, you can barely make out a little bit of a house. Sarah is inside fixing lunch for the visitors. These are the three guests who come to Abraham. And on the right-hand side, there's a bit of a hill. Again, elements of creation. Here we have the three visitors who are interpreted in the iconography of the Eastern churches as a representation of the persons of the Holy Trinity, revealing themselves during the time of Abraham in this disguise. There in the middle we see a plate with a meal on it, the meal that Sarah has prepared. And in the table, you can see that there's a kind of notch or hole in the base of the table. That is our way in, and that's also the way out of the icon. If you look at the way that the figures are formed, notice the void or the vacuum formed by the figures on the right and on the left. The empty space is the form of a cup or a chalice. And in the center of the chalice is the plate with the food. At the heart of this experience is the church and the Eucharist, surrounded by the creation in the midst of the life of the Trinity. As we look at this icon, we can imagine creation flowing out from that notch or opening in the table. Everything is flowing out from the life of the Trinity as the source. Bonaventure would call the fountain source, or the Father in the center, looks toward the Son, who is the image of who God is. And the glance of the Son toward the Spirit, who looks down upon the elements of the Eucharist and the creation. All comes from the Father through the Son in the co-beloved, the Holy Spirit, and comes forth to us as creation. It bears the image of its origins. All creation is poured forth from the heart of the Trinity. This is the theology of Bonaventure, a theology, I think, deeply rooted in the tradition of the Eastern Church. When we speak about the way that we are inheritors of a tradition, at least it's my theory, that the Franciscan tradition represents the survival of the optimistic Greek tradition in the Latin West, at a time when it became almost extinct in the East. Bonaventure is able to talk about the Word as the heart or the center of the Trinitarian community or communion. Those of you who are familiar with the work of Zachary Hayes know his book called The Hidden Center, which is a beautiful explanation of Christology from a Bonaventurian point of view. This heart or center of Trinitarian life, who is the Word or the Son, is the one through whom all creation is poured forth from that Trinitarian lunch meeting that is shown in the Rublev icon. It is poured out through the Word who is the Beloved. It is marked by the decision of love from its very origins. And everything is destined to return through the Word to shared communion in divine life. That little opening in the icon is our way into the mystery, and it's also ultimately the place of destiny, where we all, led by Christ, are led back into the place of our origin, which is in the heart of the Trinity. This is the basis of a kind of sacramental view, we might say an iconic view of creation. That things are no longer merely things. Another quotation I like from Jared Manley Hopkins is that the incarnation is the abolition of the trivial. That there is nothing that can be looked on as trivial in the light of the incarnation. And that goes from grains of sand to oak trees to images from the Hubble telescope to human faces. Nothing can be trivial. Whether small or great, each has importance because it's a gift marked by love that is divine in origin. And not only is it creation as a generic concept. I love creation, it's just deer I hate. I love the idea of creation, but I don't like to walk around in it. Why? It's too specific, it's too concrete. It sometimes has thorns and mosquitoes, spiders. We know this in Franciscan language as hekcheitas. It's a word that John Duns Scotus had to invent because he couldn't find it in theology books. This is not the time for me to be able to explain. I'm not sure I could explain all of the philosophical reasoning behind Scotus's invention of hekcheitas. In simple terms, I could put it this way, that the majority opinion at his time, and I think in ours, is that there are basically two things of which things are made. Matter, the stuff, the material, and form, the idea, the model. It's hard to give simple language to these things. If you put some matter into one of these forms, you get a thing. Scotus says the world is much more complex and specific than that. It is more than matter and form. It is this unique identity of being this particular thing. In the simplest of terms, no two rocks are alike. Each is different. Heck, thisness, is for Scotus one of the characteristics of the beings that we encounter. Uniqueness is fundamental to reality. It is not what is general and what is abstract, which should focus our attention. Rather, to look at what is different. What makes this thing, this person, this individual, this rock, if you like, different from every others. It's as if we could say everything in creation has a proper name. A good reflection, I'm not sure how intentional, of Francis's calling each creature brother and sister. Each has an identity. It is diversity and not sameness which is important here. The emphasis is on what makes me, me, what makes you, you. What makes this tree itself, and not that tree right next to it. This is neither being nor doing exactly. It is a being, our doing, and a doing of our being. That is, that each proper name becomes a verb. Henry is not just some matter called humanity and a form that's called German American male, and then just kind of accidentally he has this kind of hair and these kinds of eyes. No, Henry is Henrying. He is doing his being. We're touching on another Scotistic concept. He is, you might say, his mission is himself. His identity is his mission. We do be ourselves as each creature does its own being. Hopkins has to use poetic language in discussing this insight of Scotus. He speaks about each being ringing out like a bell its identity, doing its being. Two corollaries for this. Universals. Universals in the Franciscan view, and again this is a generalization, certainly for Scotus and those who are his followers, what we call universals: goodness, truth, beauty. These are helpful for conversation, because if we speak only in specifics, our conversations would tend to get very long. We group things together, we make abstractions or generalizations. Why? Because they help us to explain things. But it's rather a trap to move from that to giving those things real being in some world somewhere, where there exists the good, there exists the true, there exists the beautiful, and everything that we see and touch and know is actually some vague shadow or pointer, some analogy of that truly existing thing out there, which really deserves more attention. In the Franciscan tradition, at least as exemplified by Scotus, what demands our attention is what really exists, which is always unique, which is always individual. It is a trick of language to believe that there is some other world of the really real, which is filled with all of these principles, which are eternal, immutable, unchanging, and of which individual realities are some poor reflection. Again, epistemologically, how we turn the world upside down, that we are not here to serve some general principle that must be kept inviolate in some world out there that we can neither see nor touch. Our responsibility rather is to attend to difference, to attend to uniqueness. And if it's helpful to make some generalizations, use some universal categories, but don't fall into the trap to think that they're really there. If you can't have lunch with it, it's not Franciscan. Creation and its implications. This view of creation as sacramental, iconic, as being a source of theophany, revealing divine life, I think has profound implications. And let me just suggest a few. I'm sure you can think of many more. If we think of a famous painting, a fresco, again by Giotto, of the Sermon to the Birds, we can see how the Franciscan tradition has been trivialized. The story, according to its telling by Thomas of Celano, goes like this. Francis had been preaching near Bavagna, and as he was traveling along the road with his companions, he saw a large flock of birds in a field. And seeing that they were not afraid and did not fly away, he approached them. And he began to preach to them, exhorting them to praise of God. And the little sermon to the birds from what the companions recount was, dear birds, and I think in this case they were both brother and sister birds, look at how God has given you feathers to clothe you, the air as your home, and how the Creator provides for your every need, even though you neither toil nor spin nor work. You should give great praise to God. Pretty much the end of the sermon. The birds don't move. Francis is impressed. He blesses them, giving his usual greeting, "The Lord give you peace." He began then, Thomas of Celano said, as he's continuing on his journey with the companions, he begins to reproach himself because he had not preached to the birds before. He had overlooked them. And he began from that time earnestly to exhort cornfields, rocks, stones, fountains, and fields of flowers to give praise to their Creator. It's been trivialized by putting Francis in the bird bath. That's what we get. Or the sappy little statues of Francis with the squirrel here and the bird perched on his shoulder, and it becomes part of Catholic kitsch. And I think for many of us, both friars and scholars of the Franciscan movement, this story has either been ignored or romanticized. I think it should be read pretty much the way it was written. That Francis had envisioned his own mission, which was to preach penance, the mandate he had received from Innocent III, in a very narrow way. He had viewed his audience as a very narrow sector of the total possible audience. He thought his mission had to do just with people. Can you imagine what a mind-bending experience it might be when he began to look around and said that that proclamation of the word has much wider horizons, that it takes in sun and moon and stars and water and fire and air and earth and colored flowers and herbs and death and all of those brothers and sisters that eventually show up in the canticle. What does it mean to conceive of Franciscan vocation and mission in the context of this kind of marketplace, whose boundaries are the boundaries of the universe itself? Does that begin to open up a different way of looking at Franciscan vocation and mission? What's our approach to the natural world, to the sciences, or to research? Not to say that we're all going to be producing scientific researchers in our programs of formation, or that all of us are going to be experts in some branch of the natural or exact sciences. But what's the importance that they have in our fraternity and in our mission? I can think of a couple of our friars who are really rather expert in ornithology. We have some great birders in our province. We have some others who are really experts in plants, including bioengineering and these kinds of high-tech approaches to biology. I can think of others who have a deep interest in the stars. How we have trivialized that part of our tradition. Oh, he's out watching birds again. Are you still playing with those plants? Oh, he's out stargazing. What are these? Hobbies. Leisure time activities. Do we ever conceive of the vocation of the friar to be dedicated to the world of the universe, the world of creation, apart from any responsibilities in a parish or a youth group? What meaning would such a vocation have? What might this mean in the approach to the design of our formation programs? And I really have very little idea, but I suspect that it would. If we really conceived of creation as our audience and as our home, what would it mean to instill this kind of a worldview in those of us who are joining our fraternity? How much of our vision is ecclesiocentric? How much of our mission, ministry, and fraternity is actually showing some more ample vision of the world as our cloister, to quote the Sacrum Commercium? What would this mean to the issues of mission? This is beyond our formation programs. To an understanding of our Franciscan mission as having something to do with birds, or stones, or stars. What would it look like in terms of conceiving a Franciscan identity for the 21st century that might be centered in areas that people generally do not think of as the sphere of religion or the church? Where are those new boundaries that need to be explored, those zones of fracture or breakdown between the worlds of religion and science that might really be built for a Franciscan presence on those thresholds and margins?